Good evening and welcome. Tonight's debate between the two candidates is brought to you live on New York One and co-sponsored by the city's Campaign Finance Board. The board is an independent, nonpartisan city agency which runs the campaign program, publishes the New York City Voter Guide, and administers debates. The board provides public matching funds to candidates for city office who agree to limit contributions and spending, as well as provide full disclosure of their finances. To qualify for public matching funds, citywide candidates who meet a certain level of public support must by law take part in debates which are sponsored by media outlets selected by the board. Tonight's debate is being sponsored by New York One, New York One Noticias, WNYC Radio, the New York Daily News, Citizens Union, and Time Warner Cable. Our panelists tonight who will question the candidates are Brian Lair of WNYC Radio, Daily News columnist Errol Lewis, Juan Manuel Benitez of New York One Noticias, and Grace Rao of New York One News. We now introduce the two candidates. The order in which they stand and will be speaking tonight was determined earlier today by a coin toss. We welcome City Councilman Tony Avella and City Controller Bill Thompson. The format of tonight's debate is as follows. After opening statements, we will have 2 rounds of questions for the candidates, and then we'll go to a lightning round where the candidates can only answer the question with a yes or a no response. Candidates will also have the opportunity to ask a question of his opponent, and at the end, they will have closing statements. And we begin tonight with opening statements, and we start with Councilman Avella.
Well, good evening, Dominic, and I want to thank all the sponsors of tonight's debate for holding this. This is actually a very important forum. But before I go into my opening statement, I think since is the Democratic primary, that we acknowledge the passing of a great Democratic leader in the U.S. Senate, and that is Senator Ted Kennedy. So I do want to acknowledge his passing, and we should all remember him and honor him for the tremendous public service that he has done to this country. You know, the typical politician's opening speech is about the family experience. And it's usually a prepared speech that the candidate has gone over and over with the lobbyist and the consultants. Well, I haven't done that. I've actually refused to do any training for this debate tonight. I don't have any notes. I'm not going to make any notes during the debate. I want you to hear from my heart exactly what I think the issues are and the views are. And hopefully they'll come out during the question and answer. But I'm running for mayor because I am literally fed up with the corruption and the just total disregard in government for the average New Yorkers. And our campaign is about change, real change and real reform.
Thank you very much, Mr. Avella. And now we go to you, City Controller Bill Thompson.
Thank you, Dominic. I'd like to thank the Campaign Finance Board and New York One and our sponsors for this evening's debate. And two, would like to acknowledge the passing of Senator Ted Kennedy, who was a great warrior who was out there for years fighting on behalf of people all around this country and around the world. I'm a New York City lifelong resident. I grew up in Brooklyn, and also a product of New York City public schools. My mom was a public school teacher for almost 30 years. My dad, well, he worked, as a matter of fact, he went to law school at night while supporting a family and went on to become a judge in the second highest court in the state of New York. The one thing I learned from my parents was about hard work and fair play. And that's what I've tried to do all my life. You know, it's just like the people of New York City. I know what it's like to struggle to get by. I understand the challenges that face working men and women each and every day because I face those challenges myself. I'm running to be the mayor of the city of New York because I believe that we need someone in City Hall to stand up and fight for the people of this city.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. And I will begin with the first question tonight. It's to both of you, but I'll direct it first to you, Mr. Avella. A poll released today by Quinnipiac University shows that regardless of their political party, their race, or where they may live, New Yorkers strongly like Mayor Bloomberg's job performance, overall giving him a 66% approval rating. I repeat that, a 66% approval rating. With crime down, and even the White House supporting the mayor's reform in public schools, why should New York make a leadership change, and why now?
Well, I think that's just a perfect example. You can't believe every poll that comes out. Clearly, there are a number of things that Mike Bloomberg has done wrong. We could spend an entire evening, much less the 90 seconds that I have to respond. But let's talk about the first issue, why New Yorkers should toss out Mike Bloomberg, and that is the term limits issue. The people of this city voted twice for term limits. The message could not have been clearer. And the arrogance, the arrogance of billionaire Mike Bloomberg to think he's so important that he can overturn the term limits law, I think is disgraceful. He should be turned out for that reason alone. I was the one on the city council floor who said to my 29 colleagues who voted for the extension, they should all be ashamed of themselves and they should all be voted out of office. We'll talk about the issues, but that is the number one issue. That is a black mark on democracy in this city, and he should be turned out on that issue alone.
Controller Thompson.
Well, after 8 years of a Republican mayor who is focused on developers and the wealthy and has ignored working and middle-class New Yorkers, I think New Yorkers are looking for change. They want someone different in City Hall. Whether it is water rates that have gone up, whether it is assessments and other taxes that have gone up, whether it's the sales tax that it's going up, each and every one of those taxes has fallen on the backs of working and middle-class New Yorkers. I think Mike Bloomberg's continual defense for wealthy New Yorkers says to the rest of this city that we need somebody different. And I would agree also, after what he did with term limits, after that disgraceful end run around democracy, I think New Yorkers, when it comes down to it, are going to look for someone different. They want someone in City Hall who will be there for them.
Okay, let's now go to our panel in round one. We begin with Brian, who has a question for Comptroller Thompson. Brian?
Thank you, Dominic, and Controller Thompson, good evening. Let me ask you about one of those reasons that Mayor Bloomberg may score so highly in the polls, and that is education. Graduation rates that the mayor says have gone from 46% to 56% just in the last 4 years, and what the New York Times calls a steady march upward in standardized test scores. 82% of city students passed in math, up sharply from 42% in 2002, according to the Times. So do you accept that these gains are real, and why should anyone think you could do a better job for our school kids than the current mayor?
Well, I think to begin with, those standardized tests and the increase in test scores are just that, teaching to the test. Are our children learning more? Has their knowledge base increased? I don't believe so, and I don't believe others believe that also. That's what New York City has become. It has been about standardized testing. It has not. We've lost things like art and music education in the schools. Our children aren't doing better. If you look at today's newspaper, they talk about SAT scores and how SAT scores continue to decline. All that, as well as, if you look at the federal test, the NAEP that's given every 2 years, New York City has been flat for the last 4 years. I don't believe that the people of New York City believe that there's been real gain in education. I think they know that there's been improvement in standardized testing, but not in real education, and not in preparing our children to deal in a world-class economy, and not preparing our children for the jobs of tomorrow.
You know, in addition to the fact that all we do is teaching to the test, we have dumbed down the test. You talk to any teacher, you talk to any parent, and they will tell you we're reducing the number of questions that a student has to answer correctly to go from level 1 to level 2. I mean, you don't have to even get 50% on the test anymore to move on to the next grade. We are not educating kids. We're just telling them how to answer a question. That has to stop. And I believe that there has to be more involvement with the teachers and the parents. You know, my favorite expression is nobody knows their block better than the people who live there. Well, nobody knows the educational system better than the people who live it every day, and that's the teachers and the parents. Why aren't we listening to them? Why aren't we making them part of the solution? And if I'm elected the mayor of the city of New York the day after election, I'm going to bring them into the process, and we're going to have a real discussion about what should be done. And of course, you've heard me say this now for years. The first thing I do is fire Joe Klein.
A quick follow-up, if I might. Since you both dismissed the standardized test scores, what specifically would you do differently? Would you make the standardized test harder? Would you have fewer standardized tests? How would you change the educational content around testing? Controller, I guess you go.
I don't think it should be just about standardized testing. There are multiple measures to be able to look at our students and be able to see, is there improvement? Focus on literacy would help in our school system. That somehow has been lost. We're looking at students who are graduating, who are going to community college in the city of New York. In excess of 70% of them need remediation.
But specifically, would you say then fewer standardized tests?
I
Because
would
the mayor
say
would say the standardized tests measure literacy.
standardized tests are helpful, but not as a only measure. You want to look at comprehension. You want to look at the student's ability to be able not just to spit answers back, but to be able to comprehend things. Smaller classes in earlier grades. Focus on literacy. So many of those things are what we need to do right now, not just standardized testing.
Councilman, fewer tests, yes or no?
It would depend on what the tests really measure and how we evaluate them. I mean, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I'm not the expert on education. The teachers are. They should be involved in the process. And it isn't just about the test. It's about all the other things that go into the classroom. We should be asking them, what is the accurate measure of a student's performance so that they learn and that they actually have the ability to read and write, which they don't now. And as my opponent said, we have so many kids going on to college that have to take remedial courses. It is a real disgrace. And I don't care how much money Mike Bloomberg puts into his commercials that the reading scores have gone up. It's a lot of bunk. And it's the political spin.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brian. And now we go to Errol Lewis. Errol?
This question is for Councilman Avella. As the flu season approaches, Councilman, experts are predicting a surge in cases of H1N1 flu. Some say the city was slow to react when the first cases appeared earlier this year, while others call the city's response an overreaction when you consider that in a typical year, the regular flu kills 1,000 New Yorkers, far more than have died from H1N1. What do you think of the city's response to the flu threat, and what would you be doing differently as mayor?
Well, I think the threat last year was underestimated for political reasons by Mike Bloomberg. The first school that suffered from the virus was not in my council district, but it was in the next one. And I reached out to the mayor in writing immediately, and the health commissioner, saying, you can't just close one school, because the kids from those schools have siblings who go to other schools, they play in local sports teams. Why don't we look at an area-wide strategy? You know, after 2 and 3 letters, I never got an answer from Mike Bloomberg or the health commissioner. And then what happened? Within 3 to 4 months, they wound up closing more schools all over the city. There's no such thing as underestimating a situation like this. You'd rather go overboard and make sure that everybody is covered, make sure that the public and the students and the kids are safe. I don't think the city did enough, and we better damn well be prepared this year.
If I could ask you a follow-up, what about this argument that in the regular flu kills 1,000 people and we don't start shutting down schools and taking those kind of drastic measures each year?
Well, I think because the difference in this situation is because how it can be contracted and how easily it's transmitted. Obviously, even with the regular flu, you should take precautions. Clearly, we needed to do more. If we had done more in the first place, we wouldn't have had the outbreak that we did. I think that's the best example. The city blew it last time. Let's hope that while Mike Bloomberg is still in office, and we all hope he won't be, that's why we're here tonight, that there will be a different approach.
Mike Bloomberg's response to the H1N1 virus was dismal. It was a disaster. Parents were left with no information. There was no real-time information was provided to them. Rumor ran the system. Some schools closed, other schools didn't, and there was no rhyme or reason to why that occurred. That can't occur again. We have to make sure that parents want to know, are their children safe? And if there's an outbreak within their school, they want to know about it. We need to provide real-time information on a daily basis to parents. We also need to make sure that the health systems and the emergency rooms out in Queens have sufficient support. I visited Jamaica Hospital out there. Woefully understaffed. They had double what their biggest days had been as far as occupancy and people coming into the hospital in the emergency room. It was a disaster. So this time around, we need to make sure that parents have up-to-date information. We don't hide things. The Bloomberg administration can't do that again. So if there is an outbreak, as we move into the fall, we have to take all precaution to provide information, to let people know what's going on, to provide the additional support for the hospitals that are understaffed and outmanned at this point, and make sure that this is done correctly, as opposed to the last time. It was a disaster.
Do you share the councilman's estimation of the situation as it's impossible to overreact, that at the first sign of an outbreak, schools should be closed and so forth?
Any parent wants to know what's happening, and they want to be able to make the decisions themselves. Give them the information. Let them know about how many students in a school have come down with H1N1. Let them start to make decisions. And what they didn't do before the close of school was to start to define what would lead you to close a school, what would lead you to keep that school open. None of that information was provided. We need to make sure that happens this time.
Thank you, Errol. And now we go to my colleague, Manuel Benitez. Manuel Benitez, excuse me.
Thank you, Dominic. Comptroller Thompson, straight to the question. Do you feel your chances of being elected are diminished in any way because of your race? And have you ever felt that you had to be twice as good as other people to be elected just because you are African American?
I don't think my chances are diminished at all because I'm African American. I think we just witnessed an election last November where this country took a major step forward in electing the first African American president. Are there hurdles that have to be overcome? Sure there are. I'm the first African American controller in New York City's history. There have only been 2 other African American elected officials ever elected on a citywide basis in the city of New York. But I would believe that the hurdles are lower. But each and every day, we continue to make strides and steps forward. That's why I'm running. So I don't believe that I'm not going to be elected because I'm African American. I refuse to accept that. I'm going to continue to move forward and reaching out to all people across the city of New York to let them know why I'm running to be mayor of the city of New York, and let them know I believe that I can be the best mayor that this city has ever had.
So you never felt that you were a victim of stereotypes, maybe in the media or any other?
I'm not going to say that stereotypes in the media have, has many people felt some type of discrimination over the years, have African Americans? Of course. And anyone who says that that hasn't occurred probably isn't telling the truth. But I think things step by step, that's one of the reasons I'm running, to continue to make change in the city of New York, like we've made change in this country.
Thank you, Comptroller. And Councilman Avella, you've introduced legislation to require all signs, store signs in the city to be at least 50% in English. Do you think whites feel discriminated against in your borough? And have you felt that you are discriminated against in your borough because many of the signs are not in English?
Well, it's an interesting and very delicate problem to address, and I thought my legislation, and I still think it does, is a compromise. English is the predominant language. We don't have an official language in this country. There was a lot of situations where, in the city of New York, where there is language there is business signage in a foreign language. And again, given that English is the predominant language, that some people couldn't understand what the language was. There were a lot of people who thought we should have English only, and I don't agree with that. So I came up with the compromise position is, since English is the predominant language, why not have the ability to celebrate your own culture and heritage, but at least have an English translation. Beyond the fact of being a good business practice and being a good neighbor, having an English translation, it's also extremely important for first responders. If the police department, fire department, and EMS, when they respond to an emergency and they can't read the signage, that's going to affect their ability to respond. The example I always use is the fire department. When the fire department goes up to a business, what type of business that is affects their ability to fight the fire. They have to determine what type of business it is. Obviously, if it's a delicatessen, it's a different situation than it's a dry cleaner or a printing place. Actually, Newsday actually endorsed my legislation based upon that reason. We live in a multicultural society, and I think we have to learn to get along. And I think having a compromise, having an English translation, but still allowing people to celebrate their own culture and heritage, I think does that.
So
and
let me do a quick follow-up,
Sure.
Just to be fair. As a Caucasian man in Queens, have you ever felt marginalized in your borough?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't.
That's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Juan. Let's now turn to my colleague, Grace Rowell.
This is for Councilman Avella. Many of your colleagues on the City Council say you're difficult to work with and that you turn political disputes into personal ones. Given that assessment, how are you going to lead the city and convince New Yorkers to get behind you, especially New Yorkers who may not agree with your vision for the future?
Well, you know, when you say I don't get along with some of my colleagues, that's a criticism. You're damn right I don't get along with some of them. These are the same people who voted themselves a 25% pay raise. These are the same people who overturned the term limits law. These are the same people who are taking money from developers in this city. These are the people who are not paying attention to their own constituents. I'm not going to get along with them when they don't do the right thing. You know, some people say I'm the outsider. I take that as, you know, as a compliment. I don't get along with some of my colleagues. Absolutely, I don't get along with them because they're not doing the right thing. And as mayor, I want to set the example, set the tone, bring a sense of ethics and principle back to city government. Because I got to tell you, we have none now.
Comptroller Thompson, you seem to have the opposite problem. People who know you well are quick to say that you are a very nice man, but some wonder whether you have the fire and the drive to beat Mayor Bloomberg and make the tough decisions required as mayor. So my question to you is, are you too nice to have what it takes to win and to lead?
I don't think you can be too decent, which I would think that I am. At the same point, I've never had a problem in making the hard decisions. As comptroller of the city of New York, I've helped to redefine that office and make it an office that stands up and fights for New Yorkers each and every day. No matter where I've been in my history, I've been there to stand up and fight for what is right. So I'm not worried about being too decent. It's not a question of too nice, it's a question of too decent. I think that New Yorkers need a decent mayor, a mayor who's going to stand up and fight for everybody. I've been out there campaigning across the city of New York, day after day, hour after hour, talking to the people of this city about the issues that face them. I don't hear from them that they're concerned that I may be too nice. They want someone who's going to stand up and fight for them. I've shown in the past that that's what I'll do. That's the type of mayor I will be, a mayor who will stand up and fight for all New Yorkers and do what's right. So I'm not worried about taking on Mike Bloomberg right now. I've got the energy, the drive, the focus, and the principles to stand up and beat him.
Thank you very much, Grace. I just want to say to the audience here at the Public Library and also at home, in just a couple of minutes, we'll be going to our lightning round of questions, where I assure you we have some very interesting ones for the candidates, and they can only answer with a simple yes or no. We'll get to that in just a few minutes, but for right now, let's go to round 2 of our questions. We turn back to Brian Lair. He has a question for Councilman Avella.
Thank you, Dominic, and there's a yes or no question embedded in this one, too. Controller Thompson, stop and frisk is still being done by the NYPD in massive numbers, overwhelmingly of Black and Latino males, and with a very low percentage of arrests to show for it. Are you critical of the current policy, and will you promise to reduce those numbers if elected mayor?
Stop and frisk, when used appropriately, is a positive policing tool. However, I think that what we are seeing is the continued growth of that. Right now, the numbers in the first 6 months of this year indicate that we're going to hit an all-time high, and last year was another high. It looks like there'll be over 600,000 stop and frisk in the city of New York. And what we've seen is about 88% of the people who were stopped. There's nothing wrong. I think that the one thing as mayor, I would continue stop and frisk, but make sure it is used appropriately and not used to target any one group.
Would you have a target numerical reduction from that 600,000?
Setting numbers, whether for how many stop and frisks or how many there should be, I think it's a mistake. It should be used as an appropriate policing tool and not overused and not excessively used and not misused. That's what you want to be careful about.
Councilman?
Well, I'm going to stop the practice, period. And what I'm going to do as mayor is appoint a deputy mayor for human rights. This city, civil liberties, civil rights are under attack in this city. And I think it's about time, that we pay real attention to that. And I'd like to have a deputy mayor looking at these issues across the board and reporting to me each and every day as to what's really going on and how do we change things and how we make things better. Because these are real issues. These are real issues. Issues of race, violations of human liberty in the city. These are real problems which are not being addressed.
So to follow up, Councilman, stop and frisk is aimed at reducing illegal gun possession and getting guns off the streets. And the mayor touts crime being down as an achievement. So what would you replace the current stop and frisk policy with if you would abolish it that would be as effective to get guns off the street?
Well, is it effective getting guns off the street? I'm not so sure it is. I don't think it's defeating the purpose it was intended to serve, and I think it's actually serving another hidden purpose. I think the way to do it is to have a real conversation with the new police commissioner and start the leadership from the top down and set a new direction for the police department. They're an important part of our city. The police officers go out and protect us each and every day. There has to be a much more cooperative relationship. I happen to believe in community policing. I think we should get back to the old police officer who walks the beat. So the officer knows the community knows the officer, and I think that will go a long way in reducing tensions in this city and having that better relationship with the police department and the community.
Controller, you get a rebuttal. Do you think it's irresponsible to abolish stop and frisk?
I don't know that it's irresponsible. As I said, it's a police tool. It has to be managed. There has to be real oversight. We have to make sure it's not overused. When communities feel that they are being targeted, and what we're seeing is, as I said, 88% of the people who are stopped have committed no crime, have done nothing wrong. When people feel targeted, when people feel singled out, then there is something wrong, and there needs to be closer monitoring of it, and we need to make sure it is not being overused or misused.
But you're running against him right now. You're not going to take a position on whether it's irresponsible to abolish stop and frisk as he's proposed?
As I said, it's a police tool. You'll have to, you can make that determination. I'm not going to do that.
Thank you very much, Brian. Let's now go back to Mr. Errol Lewis.
This is a question for you, Mr. Thompson. We still haven't gotten to the bottom of the City Council discretionary funding scandal, in which some council staffers and at least one member so far have pleaded guilty to stealing public money, while others are accused of squandering funds on questionable projects. And there remains a question about how, when, and why money was parked in phantom accounts or allocated to non-existent charities. As mayor, what steps would you take to end such waste and abuse? And do you support an end to the use of so-called member items, which get spent at the whim of individual council members?
Well, I'm in favor of greater oversight, greater transparency, having people attest to how that money is being used. I think that's what we need to do. The one thing that we don't want to do is have everything come out of every discretionary dollar come from one location, come from a central location, come from the mayor. I think that people who are closer to their communities understand where and how money can be used and how commitments can be made. But we need oversight of this. We can't see instances where people's relatives are working in a place. We need to make sure that every dollar is being used and used effectively. And that's where the agencies have to provide better and stronger oversight. I think we've seen slush funds on both the council's part and the mayor's part. We need to make sure that that doesn't continue, that that oversight is provided, that the transparency is there, and that the penalties are swift and strong for those who violate the law.
I actually think the time has come to end discretionary funds once and for all. What we should be doing is And and the example I use is Little Leagues. I mean, there are organizations throughout the entire city that if they didn't get this discretionary funds, would probably close their doors. I've actually introduced legislation in the council to reform the entire process. Let's make each and every budget cycle special initiatives like local sports initiative, local educational initiative. And the council and the mayor would agree how much money would go in those initiatives. They would come directly out of the budget, and to allocate them per district would have to be a cooperative effort between the council member, the community board, and the agency that's going to administer the funds. So it's not just the council member at his or her whim allocating money, because there are good groups that need this money, but there's got to be better oversight. And what we're talking about and what the controller just talked about isn't going to do it. We need to change the entire process. And also the mayor has to give up some power. The city council finally has to be an equal partner in the budget process. And I'd like to be the first mayor that gives up power to make sure that the city council and the community actually have more power in this process.
Mr. Thompson?
As I said, if you eliminate discretionary dollars, you create a stronger mayor. And I don't think we need to do that. I don't think we've seen too many communities across the city of New York who've been excluded because they're not favored by the mayor. We can't allow that to continue. So I believe that it is important that the oversight be there, that the transparency be there, that all the protections are put in place, and that there is intensive scrutiny to every dollar that is allocated. That's what I think needs to happen.
Are you saying you don't trust yourself and your commissioners, if you were mayor, to be sufficiently fair and broad-minded as far as the use of the funds?
I think we're looking at history right now. So I would say that there are communities in the city of New York right now who have not received fair amounts of dollars from City Hall, from this mayor. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you very much, Errol. And now we go to Juan Manuel Benitez. Mr. Benitez?
Thank you, Dominic. And you both acknowledged Senator Ted Kennedy's passing at the beginning of the debate. He was a big advocate for universal health care. And Councilman Avella, if President Barack Obama doesn't achieve his goal of universal coverage, would you be willing to use his city resources to make sure all New Yorkers, including undocumented immigrants, are covered?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the major issues obviously facing the country. And if something isn't done on the federal level or the state level, the city has to get involved. I think you bring up a very interesting point to that question, undocumented aliens. There's a lot of criticism today in the city of New York that we shouldn't be providing benefits for undocumented aliens. But the reality of this situation is, if we don't, and especially when it comes to health care, they will then get sicker and sicker and possibly, affect the entire health care system of the city of New York. It makes sense to provide benefits for them, to make sure that they're not only well and they get taken care of, but that the administrative costs go down. Preventive care is the key, and making sure that everybody in this city, regardless of their status, citizens or not, should have health care. How we do that is part of the national discussion now. The real solution has to come from the federal government. The city of New York can't afford this. But if they don't do it, then somehow we're going to have to step up to the plate. I don't think anybody really has the answer yet, but I can tell you one of the things that this mayor and the governor failed to do was when the 2 hospitals recently closed in Queens. That was an absolute disgrace. I made the suggestion that the Health and Hospitals Corporation was actually getting money, stimulus money. Why not use some of that stimulus money for HHC to take over those 2 hospitals? The mayor sat around, Mike Bloomberg sat around, and did nothing.
But Councilman, let me clarify, because it's not likely that it's going to come from Washington, that they're going to cover undocumented immigrants. Would you cover them with the city resources if you're elected mayor?
Yes. I think I answered that, absolutely.
So you'll find the money?
Yes.
Okay. Comptroller?
I don't think... I've done a number of studies that have taken a look at health disparities in the city of New York and how based on race, based on income level, people get sick or people die earlier from things like coronary disease and diabetes and cancer, and we can't allow that to continue in New York City. I think I've been an advocate for increasing primary care, preventive primary care facilities across the city of New York, creating access for people to be able to go in and get real health care, to be able to go in on a regular basis and get a checkup, so we don't have to wait until people get sick, wind up in an emergency room, and it winds up costing all of us more, or they wind up being admitted and it costs more. We need to increase access and opportunity to health care across the city of New York. Can New York City absorb all of it on its own? No, we need the federal government's help. And we need state government's assistance also. But New York City must make the commitment and say, you know something, we're going to take care of the people of our city.
So again, Comptroller, the same question. It's not likely to happen from Washington. It's not going to happen from coming from the state. How would you use city resources?
We shouldn't be turning people away in need of
So
health
would
care.
you cover with city money?
So a
undocumented
combination
immigrants?
of federal dollars, state dollars, and city dollars to make sure that our people are provided for in New York.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. And now we go to Grace Rao. Grace?
Thank you, Dominic. Comptroller Thompson, you've raised close to $5.4 million for your campaign, but in this last fundraising period, you pulled in just $71,000. How are you going to beat Mayor Bloomberg, who's expected to spend more than $100 million on his reelection bid, when you're struggling already with your own fundraising?
Well, Grace, I would honestly say that the mayor probably isn't going to spend $100 million. It'll probably be closer to $200 million. How do you beat that kind of money? And no, we'll be able to raise additional dollars, but you can't beat him dollar for dollar. It has to be done. What we're trying to put together is the second greatest grassroots effort that this city has ever seen. We're reaching out across the city of New York. People are signing up each and every day. They want change in New York City. They want someone who's going to be there to fight for them. So how do you win this election? Much in the same way that Barack Obama won last year, with people. People beat money. And I think that's the message that we need to send out across the city of New York. And I also think people in New York City are sending the message back to Mike Bloomberg that they're not going to be bought, that their votes aren't for sale. So how do we win? With people. That's how we win.
But, Comptroller, many of those people who were supporting Barack Obama also gave small donations to his campaign. And again, in this last filing period, many down-ticket Democrats raised more money than you did for your mayoral campaign. So it seems like some of these grassroots supporters maybe aren't opening up their pocketbooks.
No, I think that if you look, people are volunteering in larger numbers. We have close to 4,000 contributors already, small numbers all across the city. That continues to grow. As this election gets closer and closer and closer, people are getting involved, they're contributing, they're giving $5, $10, $15 because they want to see real change in New York City. So I'm not concerned particularly. We're here because we're both in the New York City campaign finance system. That system, which matches dollars and small contributions on a 6 or an 8.5 to 1 basis, is valuable. And I think that you'll see many small contributions start to come in as we move along.
City Councilman Avella, your campaign has raised just over $275,000. That's far less than Democrats who are running for city comptroller and public advocate. Is this a sign that New Yorkers aren't getting behind your campaign? And how serious are you about winning if you aren't raising the money that many argue you need?
Well, I made a decision early on in this campaign that if we were going to win, it was going to be for the right reasons. I'm not selling my soul to raise huge amounts of money. I am not dialing for dollars, which every campaign consultant tells you you have to do. I'm not taking money from the big real estate industry firms like my opponent is. And I got to tell you, what I just heard, I can't believe what I just heard, that my opponent is raising money on a real grassroots effort. If that were true, why did he only just now qualify for matching funds? The truth is, my opponent is getting huge amounts of money from Wall Street, from the money managers, of the pensions he supervises, from the real estate developers. His is not a real grassroots campaign. Yes, I haven't raised the amount of money that he has, certainly not that Mike Bloomberg has. I never intended to. Money is the root of the problem in city government and in politics today. And until we change that, nobody's talking about reform. I'm talking about real reform, and that's why I've introduced campaign reform legislation to council called Clean Money, Clean Election, to eliminate this pay-to-play nonsense so that Anybody running for public office would only have to go out there and raise a small number of $5 donations. And once they get to the threshold, they would be total public financing. But I got to tell you, you look at the campaign filings, go on the website, and you see the big developers and the money managers giving money to my opponent. The fact that he said he's got a grassroots campaign, I'm absolutely shocked that he actually said that.
Comptroller, would you like to respond?
You know, if there is a candidate of real estate and big corporations, it's Mike Bloomberg. So let's be honest. This campaign, and right now, we probably have more than 3,000 volunteers, people who have signed up online, who have come into offices, who are actively engaged in this campaign, and close to 4,000 individuals who have contributed in large and small. This is a grassroots campaign, and one, if we're talking about real estate interest, look at my record on real estate interest, or look at my record there. I've stood up and fought for tenants across the city of New York, whether it's been in rent stabilization, where for 2 of the last 3 years, I've talked about 0 increases in rents. Members or people in Mitchell-Lamas, where I've stood up and fought along with them to help keep them in their homes, or those in the housing authority, as I've talked about unfair treatment in the housing authority.
But Comptroller, if I may, your campaign, though, has taken, I believe, $500,000 from money managers who've had business with the Comptroller's office, the city's pension funds. Is that a problem, that you've taken money from people who have business before you?
In my office, there is a clear separation between the professional staff who is involved in investments and the rest of the staff. They don't know who contributes, they don't know who's involved. And when we start to look at the pension boards in the city of New York, 4 of the 5 of which are chaired by the mayor's people, each and every investment goes through multiple levels of review with outside consultants, and each investment is voted on by the members of the board individually. So no, there's no pay-to-play here.
Thank you, Grace. And now it is time for our lightning round. Now, if you're new to this, it's somewhat entertaining. It's our opportunity to find out a different aspect of the personalities of the actual candidates. And here's why. No long answers. They can only respond with a yes or a no. A yes or a no, and they are required to answer the question.
Do we get shocked if we answer other than yes or no?
No, just yes or no.
And entertaining for who? Okay.
Okay, so let's get down to it. Mr. Avella, would you keep Ray Kelly as police commissioner?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson, do you have a Metro card?
Yes.
Mr. Avella?
Yes.
I know, we're both reaching. Okay.
In fact, I took the subway here.
Mr. Avella, have you ever been arrested?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson, do you own a gun?
No, never.
Mr. Avella?
No.
Mr. Avella, was David Dinkins a better mayor than Rudy Giuliani?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson, have you been in a taxi within this past week?
No.
Mr. Avella?
No.
Mr. Avella, excluding marijuana,
You can include it.
excluding marijuana, have you ever tried an illegal drug?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson, have you ever smoked marijuana?
Yes.
Mr. Avella?
No, I haven't. No.
Mr. Avella?
I haven't inhaled, and I haven't even smoked a cigarette, so no, I haven't.
Mr. Avella, has Michael Bloomberg been a better mayor than Rudy Giuliani?
Oh,
Yes or no?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson, should New York City name a subway station or a street after Michael Jackson?
Yes.
Mr. Avella.
Why not? Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Mr. Avella, have you ever been in a fist fight as a grown man, an adult?
No.
Mr. Thompson.
No, not yet. No. No. Of real estate and big corporations. It's Mike Bloomberg, so let's be honest. This campaign, and right now, we probably have more than 3,000 volunteers, people who have signed up online, who have come into offices, who are actively engaged in this campaign, and close to 4,000 individuals who have contributed in large and small. This is a grassroots campaign, and one, if we're talking about real estate interest, look at my record on real estate interest, or look at my record there. I've stood up and fought for tenants across the city of New York, whether it's been in rent stabilization, where for 2 of the last 3 years, I've talked about 0 increases in rents. Members or people in Mitchell-Lamas, where I've stood up and fought along with them to help keep them in their homes. Or those in the housing authority, as I've talked about unfair treatment in the housing authority.
But Comptroller, if I may, your campaign, though, has taken, I believe, $500,000 from money managers who've had business with the Comptroller's office, the city's pension funds. Is that a problem, that you've taken money from people who have business before you?
In my office, there is a clear separation between the professional staff who is involved in investments and the rest of the staff. They don't know who contributes, they don't know who's involved. And when we start to look at the pension boards in the city of New York, 4 of the 5 of which are chaired by the mayor's people, each and every investment goes through multiple levels of review with outside consultants, and each investment is voted on by the members of the board individually. So no, there's no pay-to-play here.
Thank you, Grace. And now it is time for our lightning round. Now, if you're new to this, it's somewhat entertaining. It's our opportunity to find out a different aspect of the personalities of the actual candidates. And here's why. No long answers. They can only respond with a yes or a no. A yes or a no, and they are required to answer the question.
Do we get shocked if we answer other than yes or no?
No, just yes or no.
And entertaining for who? Okay.
Okay, so let's get down to it. Mr. Avella, would you keep Ray Kelly as police commissioner?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson, do you have a Metro card?
Yes.
Mr. Avella?
Yes.
I know, we're both reaching. Okay.
In fact, I took the subway here.
Mr. Avella, have you ever been arrested?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson, do you own a gun?
No, never.
Mr. Avella?
No.
Mr. Avella, was David Dinkins a better mayor than Rudy Giuliani?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson, have you been in a taxi within this past week?
No.
Mr. Avella?
No.
Mr. Avella, excluding marijuana,
You can include it.
excluding marijuana, have you ever tried an illegal drug?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson, have you ever smoked marijuana?
Yes.
Mr. Avella.
No, I haven't. No.
Mr. Avella.
I haven't inhaled, and I haven't even smoked a cigarette, so no, I haven't.
Mr. Avella. Has Michael Bloomberg been a better mayor than Rudy Giuliani?
Oh, that's...
Yes or no?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson, should New York City name a subway station or a street after Michael Jackson?
Yes.
Mr. Avella.
Why not? Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Mr. Avella, have you ever been in a fist fight as a grown man, an adult?
No.
Mr. Thompson.
No, not yet. No.
Mr. Thompson, here in New York City, have you ever personally received a parking ticket?
Yes. I think every citizen in New York has, unfortunately.
Who hasn't? Yes.
Mr. Avella, is it ever acceptable to spank a child?
I don't think so. No.
Mr. Thompson.
No, I never spanked mine.
Mr. Thompson, do you own and use a bicycle?
Own, don't use. Or better yet, borrow my wife's. Let me be honest.
Own, haven't had the time to use it for a long time.
Mr. Avella, should he run, will you endorse David Patterson for governor next year? Yes or no?
That always depends upon who the other candidate
No,
is.
yes, yes or no? He's a fellow Democrat.
I know. Well, are you talking about the Democratic Party or the
Should
Republican
he run,
Party?
Should he run for governor
Yeah.
next year, will you endorse him? Okay, I'll help you out. In the general election,
In the general election, yes.
in the primary now.
You're not leaving me much ground here.
Yes or no, Mr. Avella?
No.
Yes.
In the general election?
Yes.
In the Democratic primary?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, we're here at one of the most beautiful libraries in the entire world. Do you have a library card?
I don't right now. My children do. I
No,
don't.
No?
No, I don't.
Mr. Avella.
I don't have one either.
Mr. Avella, have you ever called 311?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson, is David Patterson a better governor than Eliot Spitzer?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Avella, have you been to the new Yankee Stadium?
No.
No.
Mr. Thompson, have you been to the new Citi Field, the Met Stadium?
It's been a busy year. No.
I'm a Mets fan, and I still have to say no.
Our final lightning round question goes to you first, Mr. Avella. Have you ever voted for someone who was not a Democrat?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
No.
That concludes our lightning round. And so, I would like to explain what's coming up next. We're going to continue with a round of questions from the panel. And once that's done, we're going to start with Grace Rao in just a second. And once that's done, you gentlemen will have the opportunity to question each other. And so, we turn back to Grace Rao.
Thank you, Dominic. For Comptroller Thompson, We are fast approaching the 10-year anniversary of the terrorist attack on New York, and there's been little progress on the World Trade Center site. In fact, the Port Authority and the site's developer, Larry Silverstein, are at a stalemate. What would you do differently than Mayor Bloomberg to make sure the site developed quickly, and how much is the mayor to blame for the impasse?
Well, I think that the fact that there is nothing at Ground Zero is a national disgrace. It's something that should not have occurred. And I think that the mayor should have assumed leadership. If we looked at all the layers of government that got in the way, I think the mayor should have tried to cut through that, assumed leadership, and got something done at Ground Zero. So I've been disappointed in his failure to move forward there. I think it is important, and it was important from day one, that we make a statement that New York City will never back down. And I think that the fact that we haven't done something at Ground Zero and that the mayor hasn't been more vocal and more involved and assumed greater leadership, I think that's a failure.
What would you specifically do that's different if you were elected?
This is one of those, the mayor has talked a lot about doing something, but then again, every time, the conversations begin, he's backed off and pointed fingers at others. Assume leadership, step up on this one, bring those parties who have involvement in this to the table and force movement forward. I just think that in New York City that the mayor needs to take greater responsibility for Ground Zero, whether it's pushing the Port Authority and others to give more control, that should happen. But I think that the fact that nothing's occurred there has been absolutely dismal and something that should not have occurred.
Councilman Avella, same question for you.
It is a national disgrace that we still have nothing going on that site, that there's been no building going up, that the memorial has only just started. The mayor of the city of New York should have, from day one, taken a leading role in this. It is unfortunate that he allowed the Port Authority and the private owners to squabble back and forth. It's interesting that the mayor has used the process of eminent domain in this city to take people's property, to take people's business. Yet here's a situation where he should have stepped in and the city taken this property and built it. That's what has to be done. If these owners and the Port Authority and all the principals can't get together, then the mayor should say to the governor and the president, listen, we're taking the property. We're going to take it. Because this sends a statement abroad that we can't recover from the attack of 9/11. The mayor, for the one time to do the right thing, to use eminent domain if he has to take this property. And like I say, it's funny he's using it in other parts of the city to take people's private business and their homes, but he won't do it in the one situation where it would be appropriate. And let me just also mention, it is an absolute disgrace how we are treating the first responders who have gotten ill from going down to that site, who are fighting for benefits and they can't get it, who have to literally document the fact that they're sick and dying, and then they have to attribute that disease to going there after 9/11. That is an absolute disgrace, and that falls upon the mayor.
Comptroller, do you think the city should take over the project and should be in charge of developing the site?
If I were mayor, I'd like to have control and oversight of Ground Zero, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Grace. And now we go back to Juan Manuel Benitez.
Thank you, Dominic. Councilman Avella, you're a big advocate for small businesses and a fighter against big development. After the collapse of the financial industry, don't you fear that New York City will lose its international clout if you don't think big in terms of development and innovation?
Naturally, you have to do that. But I also think that there's advantage in thinking small and thinking from the bottom up. A lot of the philosophy in this city, including the planning and development, is all from the top down. It's the mayor, it's the Department of City Planning, it's the real estate industry that controls the agenda in Wall Street. I think we'd do much better if we did things from the bottom up and let the people work in their own neighborhoods to plan for their neighborhoods, for their communities. Let them do work with the developers. And I think if we do that, you'll have a much better city, and you'll find those innovative solutions come out of those discussions.
So you don't have any big projects in mind in case you're mayor of the city? You would wait for neighborhoods to come up with
That's
plans
what
and
we do
projects?
now. There's no planning in this city. Mike Bloomberg isn't doing planning. He reacts to the real estate industry in this city. And how many of his major projects have actually happened? We have to change the whole philosophy in this city. Because the problem with what you're saying is, it comes down again to money. It shouldn't be about money. It should be about people in this city. And until we change that dynamic, we're always going to be in the same situation. You talk about the financial crisis. Absolutely, we have to deal with this. But the way to deal with it is to strengthen small business, is to bring back the manufacturing jobs, which the mayor has basically undercut. And also, we're now one of the worst cities in the country for small business. Let's do something about that, and then we'll, come back to address the Wall Street, crisis. Let's strengthen small business. Let's do something about the escalating rents. Let's bring back the manufacturing jobs, because right now, under Mike Bloomberg, you have what is called mixed-use zoning, where it's manufacturing and residential. Wherever he's done that, you get the luxury housing. It pushes out the manufacturing. Let's bring back those jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Comptroller, what would you do to keep New York City as the so-called capital of the world, and how are you going to fill that vacuum now left by the collapse of the financial industry?
Well, a couple of things. And first, make the assumption that we can't do two things at the same time. Small business in New York City right now, those with fewer than 100 employees, account for half of the jobs in the city of New York. We need to create focus and help small businesses grow in the city. We need to use city resources to provide access to capital. We need to also work with those small businesses to help them cut through red tape and move forward and grow and be able to hire additional individuals. We need to make note of the fact that the biggest growth area in the city of New York has been those who are self-employed, who now account for almost 20% of the workforce in New York City, and yet we haven't shifted and made any change to help accommodate that or support that. At the same point, is Wall Street going to bounce back? Yes, but one thing that, let's look and be honest, the Bloomberg administration, as we look at the mega projects that they've rolled out for growth and development, most of those have failed. Most of those aren't moving forward, whether it was the stadium on the west side, whether it's Hudson Yards, whether it is places like Willets Point and Atlantic Yards, those projects haven't moved forward. There's been this over-reliance on Wall Street, and it appears as if Wall Street that they thought Wall Street would carry us forever. That didn't happen. We need to diversify the economy of this city. We need to do things I talk about, smart growth and fair growth, that involves communities.
If I may, so to clarify, do you have a plan? Now that people say that the financial industry is not going to come back the same way it was in the past, do you have a plan to compete with cities like London, Paris, Tokyo?
As I said, I think that London, Paris, and Tokyo have run into the same problems that New York has as a world financial capital. New York City will bounce back there. But also, there has to be the focus created on growing small business. I've talked about things like retail retention zones, talked about greater access to capital, about preservation of small businesses, helping them grow, helping New York City through the businesses that we do each and every year and the billions of dollars that are expended, help those small businesses grow. We can do two things at the same time. Wall Street will bounce back. At the same point, we need to diversify and grow small businesses in this city.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Juan Manuel. Now we go to Mr. Errol Lewis.
This question is for you, Comptroller Thompson. The need for affordable housing ranks near the top of the list of most New Yorkers' concerns. You've often talked about increasing the amount of it, but affordable can be a very vague term that means different things to different people, and being mayor is about making hard choices, setting clear priorities. Using dollar figures, can you describe the specific range of household income of families that you think most need subsidized housing in the short term?
You know, the one thing that we start to get into discussions of AMI and what income levels are suitable, there's a great need in the city of New York for low, moderate, and middle income housing. It's those who are making $20,000 or $25,000 a year who need assistance. It's those who are making $50,000 and $60,000 a year who are having a hard time each and every day getting by in the city of New York. It's the two workers, the two individuals who work for the city of New York, a teacher and perhaps a fireman, who are making $100,000 but are still having a hard time getting by. I don't know that we can just limit it and say, this is the range that we're going to help build housing. I think it's important that we build housing across that spectrum, low, moderate, middle-income housing, so we can help keep working New Yorkers and middle-income New Yorkers here. So it's hard to say, this is the limit, this is the range, and put a dollar number on it. I think that, we're looking at New Yorkers across the city of New York, low, moderate, middle-income New Yorkers who are struggling to stay here. And we need to step up and provide real housing and real support for them.
But in some ways, I mean, that does get to my question, but January 1st, if you're sworn in, and there's a parcel that's in front of you, you're going to have to pick between those three ranges. Which would you select?
That's making an assumption that there's only one parcel. And I think that what we have to do is to start making choices that are fair and equitable. I've talked about a new 21st century Mitchell-Lama program. Back in the 50s and over a period of years in the 60s, we saw tens of thousands of units that were built all across the city of New York for moderate income individuals. That helped. That helped people stay here. That helped people bring their families up. Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, so many other places. Those were places that were more affordable. That's drying up little by little by little by little. We need to increase that supply again so that all New Yorkers, low, moderate, middle-income New Yorkers, can afford to stay here, bring their families up, and have their families stay here and grow in New York City if they want to.
Well, first of all, when we do affordable housing in the city, it's based upon the Metropolitan Area Median Income, AMI for short. It's also based upon fair market rent calculation. When we do affordable housing, it's based 80% of that figure. Unfortunately, that figure also includes the wealthier neighborhoods of Westchester and Long Island, so it raises up that city income level. The average affordable housing component, based upon 80% of that figure, is about $61,000. That's not affordable to the people who need it, but that's what we're doing in the city of New York now. That has to change. What I've been working on is legislation, and I think this goes to the heart of your question, that when we do a project in a particular neighborhood, the income level should be based on the income level of the people of that neighborhood, so that the people in that neighborhood will get to benefit by it. If we do other projects in other neighborhoods, it should depend upon the income level in those neighborhoods. And yes, we have to do it for various levels, low-income families, working families, and middle-income families. It has to be across the board. $61,000 isn't affordable to the people who need it. The other thing is we have to get in the business of doing affordable housing. The city is going to have to allocate capital dollars to do this. And as part of that, we also have to stop this rush to build luxury housing in the city and letting the developers do whatever they want. The other component is we have to do something about the escalating rents. And I, too, went down to the Rent Guidelines Board and said, you should have 0 increases. As mayor, I'm getting rid of the Rent Guidelines Board because they're a landlord-dominated agency. It should be the Housing Preservation and Development Agency that reviews the rents and let the mayor make the final decision. So if the people of this city feel they're being treated unfairly, let them take it out on me as the mayor of the city of New York, and not 5 appointed board members who are not answerable to anybody, except the tenant representatives.
Thank you very much, Arrow. And now we turn again to Mr. Brian Laird.
Thank you, Dominic. Councilman Avella, a question about the city's relationship with Albany. Albany. Over his term, Mayor Bloomberg has won some victories there, like getting and retaining mayoral control of schools, and had some big defeats, like congestion pricing in the West Side Stadium. What would your top priorities be for our lovely state legislature? And if you're elected mayor, why should we think you'd be any more effective at influencing them?
Well, I think, first of all, I am not in favor of total mayoral control of the schools. I think there's a compromise there. And what I would do is try and work with the teachers and the parents and all the educators and the stakeholders to come up with a new system that we could be proud of. That would be the priority in Albany. But the other thing, and I don't want to get too specific on this, but there are so many issues, so many things that New York City doesn't have control over. A lot of the things that affect us directly are controlled by Albany. I mean, for example, the only tax that we control is the property tax. I think it has to be a priority, and it would be for the next mayor, and hopefully I'm the next mayor, that to go up to Albany and say, we need to have more local jurisdiction. One of the major issues that I'm going to go up to Albany, and this is legislation that I've already introduced, I think the MTA should be broken up. I think it's about time that we in this city got control over our own buses and subways. We're one of the few metropolitan cities in this country, if not one of the only major metropolitan city in this country, that doesn't have control over its own buses and subways. State legislature has to do that. We can't do that on our own. So there are a lot of things that the mayor can do and work with Albany to try and get some local jurisdiction because, again, you know, like I said before, nobody knows their block better than the people who live there. Well, New Yorkers know their city better than the people up in Albany.
Controller Thompson, same question. Top priorities for Albany. How do you get them to do it?
Well, for the first time, I think I'd like to go to Albany and start to work to get us a fair share of resources from Albany. We continue to be shortchanged by Albany, and probably the area that I'd like to focus on the first is mass transit. Shown over the years how we continue to be shortchanged. Formulas capped, money sent to Long Island and Westchester as opposed to sending to New York City. So that would be the first priority in getting a fair share of revenue and dollars from Albany for New York City. And the area within that I probably the first focus within that would be in mass transit. How to get it done? I think I've always had a collaborative style and been able to bring people together to talk about common goals. That's how I do it. Bringing the legislative leaders in all houses as well as the governor together to talk about the priorities in the city of New York, to start to talk about and show how we are shortchanged each and every day and fight for a fair share of our revenue.
And just real briefly, both of you, this has been the summer of Albany dysfunction on full display. Councilman, first, what's your own opinion of the new leadership of the state Senate, especially the Senate Majority Leader Pedro Espada? Is he our partner in working for the city's best interests, or corrupt and self-interested, or how would you characterize him?
Corrupt and self-interested. And I think anybody who says differently is lying.
Controller?
I think that what's happened in Albany is a disgrace. It is dysfunctional, it is disgraceful, it has hurt the city, it has hurt the state.
And on Espada particularly?
I don't believe that he has been a friend to New York City. Let me be blunt about that. I don't know, I don't know if he has any friends in Albany, but definitely not a friend to New York City.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. And now it's time to give the candidates an opportunity to ask a question of his opponent. The answer will be limited to 90 seconds. There will be a 60-second rebuttal, and there may be a 30-second response. We begin now with Councilman Avella.
Mr. Controller, and this is not personal. This is not personal.
Okay.
I have to say that up front. But there have been a number of articles about the pension scandal and going into your office. And was one of the questions that was mentioned already about the fact that you have taken $500,000 from these pension managers. Two of your former employees went on to form their own company, who then got business from your office, who then contributed money back to your campaign. Have you been investigated as part of from what I understand, an ongoing investigation? Have you been asked to comment by the FBI, the Securities Exchange Commission, or the Attorney General on any of these issues?
Absolutely not. And as a matter of fact, we have been working with, first, let me clarify one thing. No, scandal hasn't touched my office. That's the first thing. If what's going on in the state of New York and New York State Common under a different controller has had nothing and has had no touch and reach to my office. I pointed out earlier before that every investment in that is done through the New York City pension funds goes through multiple levels of scrutiny, goes through outside consultants, multiple trustees representing both unions as well as the mayor's office. So no, there's been no scandal in New York City. I'm very proud of that. When we look across the country and look at some other pension funds that are having problems, no, New York City has not been touched by those scandals.
Well, my only rebuttal would be, I guess it's how you define scandal. You know, to be perfectly honest, I think it's extremely unethical, and I think it is a scandal to have a situation where two of your former employees who set up a different investment schedule and procedure then leave your office, then are given huge amounts of millions of dollars to invest, and then donate money back to your election campaign. I think that's a scandal. I'm sorry. I disagree.
And the fact that the reality is those gentlemen came from the investment world. We were fortunate to lure them to New York City to work along with us at taking major cuts and major reductions. They went back to the business that they were involved in, and they went through the same hurdles, they went through the same process, the same level of scrutiny that everybody else does. So, as we look at what's going on, I've been happy to work with the SEC and making recommendations there for oversight and greater transparency and contributions, working with the New York State Attorney General, Andrew Cuomo, in putting new rules out there for others to follow. So I'm proud of the work that New York City has done. I'm proud of the work that I've done.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Controller, it's your turn to ask the question.
Look, I have a slightly, when it comes to Mike Bloomberg, what's the worst thing that you think he's done with regard to this city?
Well, thanks for the softball. Clearly, I think, I said from the very beginning what the worst thing he's done, and that's the term limits extension. I mean, that was an absolute disgrace. Clearly, he has dealt a fatal blow to democracy in this city. And I think we'll both agree that the only way to defeat that, to change that, is to vote this guy out of office.
It's one of the areas that it's one of the things that you thought that we'd come to agreement on. And I think that we both agree that there's a need for real change in the city of New York. And I was proud to stand up and oppose the term limit issue and be one of the lead plaintiffs against the change in term limits that Mike Bloomberg pushed through. So it's one of the areas that we can agree on that I thought it was disgraceful what had occurred.
Okay, so now I'm going to flip the question a little bit. What's the best thing Mike Bloomberg has done for this city, starting with you, Mr. Thompson?
Smoking ban.
Why?
I think it, in the long run, it helped to save lives. The smoking ban, I thought that was good. Once you got through the rocky beginning, I thought it was good for New York City.
Mr. Avella.
311. I think that was an idea that had been in the process for decades. He deserves credit for setting it up. A lot more needs to be done to make it the system that it should be, but he should get credit for 311.
And does he, at the end of the day, before we go back to the questions, deserve any credit for using his own money? I mean, there are some that believe it's a good thing that he's financing his own campaigns. He don't deserve any credit for that, Mr. Avella?
No. So he's taking $1 a year. How is it that when he became mayor, he was worth $3 billion, and somehow, even though the economy of the United States was on the downturn, he is now worth between $16 and $18 billion. You cannot tell me that he didn't use the position of mayor to further his own financial wealth. And I know, as chairman of zoning and franchises, I believe that he used the information in his office through Deputy Mayor Dan Doctoroff to help his company when it came to negotiations with the cable franchise renewals. And I think that actually came out in part in the New York Times. It's amazing to me how he was able to increase his financial wealth multifold, yet somehow he didn't see the financial crisis coming on the scene to New York City.
Do I think he deserves credit for spending obscene amounts of money to try and convince or to try and buy the votes?
But is there something to be said, Mr. Thompson, for the man using his own money and not being forced to use taxpayer money?
Dominic, New York City has probably the best public finance law in the nation. If Mike Bloomberg wanted to get credit, then spend his own money and adhere to the same levels. But spending in excess of $100, $150 million, or $200 million, you don't deserve credit for that. No, because it's your money, because you're using it to try and influence and taint a process, no, you don't get credit for that.
And we're going back to the questions. We're going back to the questions in 1 second. But is it also a good thing that he donates so much of his money to organizations in New York City that desperately need these dollars?
Contributions with no strings attached are something that's admirable. contributions with strings attached and expectations, something's wrong with that.
This is, we talk about the $200 million that the mayor is going to spend, Mike Bloomberg is going to spend in the re-election. We don't know what the real figure is on how much money he's donating to the nonprofits. It's a good thing, but there are strings attached. He's, in effect, buying their silence as to how the city is truly running. And that's a disgrace because he's not donating that money for charitable purposes. He's donating that money as an extension of the campaign.
But Mr. Avella, he's donated money years in advance of running for public office.
But not as much. Not as much. And the focus has changed dramatically. And we all know that.
Okay. I just want to remind the candidates that you have 90 seconds to respond to the question, a 60-second rebuttal, and then another 30-second rebuttal on the other side. Let's turn now back to round 4 of our questions. Let's turn back to Brian Lehr.
Thank you, Dominic. Controller Thompson, will you fight for anything like the congestion pricing plan that Mayor Bloomberg tried to get, or anything else to monetize the demand to drive into Midtown and help the environment and the traffic flow that way?
Well, I think that before you can talk to people about getting out of their cars and not driving, you have to create greater mass transit. The one thing that is missing, there's so many parts of the city of New York, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, where people can't get to work in quick fashion because they don't have access to mass transit. We need to make the investment in express buses. We need to make the investments in upgrade of subways across the city of New York. Those are things that need to be done. Before you can talk to people about getting out of their cars, you have to make it so you have to create a situation so that they can get.
The mayor was trying to fund that through congestion pricing. Would they go hand in hand for you?
I had recommended and recommended when the MTA was going through its crisis two things. Number one, an increase in registration fees on automobiles based on the weight of those automobiles. Lighter, more fuel-efficient vehicles, you'd pay less. That would have generated $1 billion right there. And it's time to bring back the commuter tax. Come on. If we're going to talk about mass transit, let's bring the commuter tax back and have some of that go into mass transit. That would generate the money that we need.
Councilman.
Well, first of all, I was an opponent of congestion pricing. Nobody drives into Manhattan for the pleasure of it, to be perfectly honest. They drive because they have to. And all that was going to be was a tax on people. Even the mayor's own proposal, I think, stated that traffic was only going to be reduced by 15%. We need to find other ways to fund mass transit, and that's the key. If you give people more opportunities to ride the bus and the subway, they'll take it. One of the suggestions that I've made is changing the 2nd Avenue subway project to light rail. The 2nd Avenue subway project is eating up almost the entire capital budget of the MTA, $5 billion. Instituting light rail will be $500 million. We could do it faster, we could do it cheaper. We could take that money and then expand mass transit on Staten Island, in Queens, in Brooklyn, and in the Bronx. Why aren't we looking at these alternative transportation modes? That's what we should be doing. But we don't have control of the MTA, and that goes back to getting control of the MTA.
And very briefly, neither of you ride your bicycles, I gather, but Mayor Bloomberg's Transportation Commissioner, Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, has a reputation of being very progressive for multiplying bike lanes, pushing for bus rapid transit, closing streets to car traffic, including Times Square and Herald Square. Does she deserve reappointment, Controller?
I think you bring your own team to the table. So no matter how progressive, I think it's important that a mayor bring their own team along with them.
No, I think she's done a terrible job. A terrible job. And all those things you mentioned, some of them are good ideas, but there has to be community involvement. You can't just dictate from the top, hey, tomorrow, here's a bike lane. Here, we're going to close off the street, without having communication with the elected officials, the community board, and the neighborhoods. And that's why she should be fired.
Terrible job.
The one thing that you will hear across the city of New York, and I think I favor bicycle lanes, however, you're hearing a complaint all across the city of New York because communities have not been consulted. They've been ignored. Bicycle lanes have been dropped upon them, and there has been no discussion. That's wrong, and that shouldn't continue.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Did you have a follow-up?
That was my follow-up. You can go
Okay,
on.
thank you very much, Brian Leah. Let's now turn to Mr. Errol Lewis.
Thank you, Dominic. This is for you, Councilman Avella. Despite plans to reduce the number of New Yorkers living in homeless shelters, recent numbers show a sharp rise in the number of homeless families in the system. Do you attribute that to the sagging economy or to mistaken or failed policies by the Bloomberg administration? And if it's the latter, what would you do differently as mayor?
Well, it's probably a combination of both, but Mike Bloomberg's policies have failed miserably. He has cut the budget for homeless services. I mean, the classic example is Peter's Place in Midtown Manhattan, which is the only shelter in the entire city that helped elder homeless individuals. That's gone because the mayor cut the funding. He's also cut funding to houses of worship that provide voluntary homeless services. We fought to get that back. I actually was at 2 press conferences about that. We need to develop a policy that recognizes that homeless individuals need help. It has to be done on a case-by-case basis, and we should be reaching out to all those organizations that are involved in this process and having a real discussion and recognize that without this help, these people are just going to continue to be homeless. But then there's the other aspect of the problem, which was one of your questions, affordable housing. A lot of the new homeless people are out in the street because they can't afford the escalating rents. We have to do something about that. If we don't, there's just going to be more and more people on the street. So it has to be a multifaceted approach.
The policy, as attempted at least, was to provide housing for families, so that money for some of the kind of programs you're talking about might have been reduced, but the money was supposed to at least go into housing. The idea being housing first and let the rest of the services then travel behind that. Is that a mistaken approach, or did they just not execute it properly?
I don't think they've executed it at all, to be perfectly honest. You know, Mike Bloomberg's administration, when he was running for office the first time, I seem to remember he saying one of the criticisms about government is we've had government by press release. That's the only thing he does. I mean, he comes out with a press release, whether it's homeless or affordable housing or what have you, and then there's never any follow-up. There's never any follow-up. I don't think they've actually implemented any plan when it comes to the homeless population. If anything, they've said that the homeless numbers have gone down. And of course, you just walk down any street. I was at the Working Families Party endorsement meeting, and on the way into the meeting, there was a homeless person on the street, which I actually stopped by and I talked to and I offered my help. And to be perfectly honest, I gave him a few dollars. But it's the example. You can go down any street in the city of New York and see these individuals. Why aren't we doing something about this? Because clearly Mike Bloomberg isn't.
Mike Bloomberg, who said that he would cut homelessness by 2/3, has failed miserably. I think if we look, there are a number of reasons that have created a rise of homelessness in the city of New York. Legal services have been reduced, so families are being evicted. That's contributed to homelessness. We're looking at Section 8 vouchers, which used to go to homeless families on a priority basis. That's been ended. We're looking at, and as you look at scatter site housing, it's disastrous across the city of New York. There are places that you wouldn't put your worst enemy in. So we've seen a rise in homeless, and then foreclosure. I was in South Jamaica a couple of weeks ago, and we're out talking to people. It's an epicenter of foreclosures across the city of New York. And we were talking to a number of people who were trying to hold on to their homes. As I started to leave, one of the reporters said, "Hey, there's a lady in the doorway who'd like to talk to you." It's an elderly lady. I went over, she's partially disabled. I went over to talk to her. She showed me not her foreclosure notice. She'd been foreclosed on. She had lost her house, and her question was, could I help her in finding an apartment? There's something wrong with that in New York City. And this administration, this Bloomberg administration, has done nothing to help. That's why we're seeing a rise in homelessness. Either we believe that and look at the real facts that stand before us, or we believe the mayor and his answer to why did homelessness increase? It's because the facilities are nicer and people want to move there. No one wants to move into a homeless facility. It's an incredible failure of this administration.
And just to follow up, Mr. Thompson, your solution as if elected as mayor, would be what? How would you handle these issues differently?
I would, obviously, we talk about increase in housing, but I would use Section 8 vouchers to help homeless families again and start to give them priority. I would increase legal services to be able to help keep people in their homes so we prevent people being thrown out and prevent them from being homeless. And one other thing that I would not do, I wouldn't start charging homeless families rent as this administration is doing. It is outrageous. If anything, if you say the state is forcing you to collect rent, put it in savings accounts so people can get out of homeless shelters. Don't lock them into a life and an eternity in a homeless facility.
Okay, we're very short on time. We have time for a quick rebuttal. Do you have a response to that?
No.
You don't?
No.
Juan, do you have a quick question?
We agree.
Very quick. Both of you use the subway system. Do you think $2.50 a ride is a fair price? And if not, what would be the fair price?
Is it a fair price? No. Is there a fair price? It would obviously be lower than $2.50. I think if you talk about, what we need to be able to do that is to find additional revenue, and let's, for a change, get the federal government back into mass transit. Systems all across this country are having problems, and in New York City, strap hangers are asked to pay a higher percentage in the fare box than other systems around this country. Let's create a little more fairness.
Councilman?
The answer is, of course not. People think that they're paying way too much now for subway service. There have been ideas that have come across in the past few decades, actually, about making the subway system free. The key is to providing the funding, because when you make it free, more people will use it. There'll be less people, on the roads, and the economy will improve in this city.
Are you promising free?
I'm not promising it. But what I'm going to tell you is that these are some of the ideas that we should start taking a serious look at. I also happen to believe that there should be free, tuition at CUNY. These are some of the things that we should be looking at.
Thank you.
That is all the time we have for the questions.